Let me get caption. And we'll do this share. I figure out how to turn the light mode on the online compiler so it's a little bit easier to see on this screen in the front. Okay, so we are going to work on our lab today. We should have enough time, and also we are going to, well, you have some assignments that's going to be due, and I think in November for Unit 5, but don't forget about the midterm. So take the time to do that this week. So half of the rest of chapter 5 goes over one additional loop, and then I'll show you how you can do a running sum, which is a very popular technique using a for loop or a while loop. So you'll be able to learn how to do that. And then we will work on sentinels, which is like a way that we can stop the program, a certain task in the program, or we can stop the program from running using a certain key on the keyboard. And then we will work on file operations. So file operations allow us to stream our data from our program into a file, and then we're going to read from that particular file. So to start, we'll look at part A. And where we left off on Tuesday was we wrapped up with the do while. So you learned 2 loops so far. We are going to talk about the for loop. This is a very popular loop, and you do see this similarly in other languages, just the syntax is a little bit different. So it is a way that we can repeat a certain task up to a number of times. So unlike the while loop, you can control more in the for loop, where let's say I want to loop it 6 times, then I can specify that in the parentheses of my for loop. So there are 3 components that you need to put in the parentheses next to the keyword for. How you start the loop, which is the initialization. Let's say that we want to start with number 1, right? And what kind of, so how do you want it to repeat? So it's going to check for the condition every time it runs the loop. So just like all the other loops, the condition needs to go inside the parentheses as well. So I can say that, let's say I want to loop 6 times, and every time we want to check true for, let's say our count, right? So the condition needs to be specified here. We can do using an operator, right? Like having a comparison operator here, or whatever you want to specify for your condition. And then how do you want the system to, or the loop to update? So we want to increment every time we loop. So we're going to loop up, or you can also decrease if you want to loop down. And when it reaches that maximum, it's going to stop. Okay. So that's a little bit better than what you see in the while loop, where sometimes that can be infinitely running. So keep in mind that you're always going to have these 3 components, and they are separated by the semicolon, not comma. Okay. All right. So in this example, we're going to count from 1 through 5, and we're just simply using a loop. And for loop is very useful when you learn about array, so we can access the container, the elements in the container. So in this case, we are going to loop, and every time that it loops, it's going to give us a count. So what we have is we have a variable called I, and you often see programmer use the I to be able to initialize the counter. So that's going to be a variable that's going to hold count to start, right? The start of the loop. So I have a start at 1. Now, can you start at 0? You can. Then you're going to have to make sure that your condition is under 5 if you're counting to 5. So if I start at 0, then my operator has to only be less than, not equal to. Okay. So here I'm going to start at 1. And I wanted to loop it up to 5 because we want to count to 5. So I is going to be less than or equal to 5, right? And each time that it loops, we are going to do a postfix. So it's going to increase after each loop. Okay, it's going to count up. And we simply going to do a cout to display each count for each loop. So it's when it looped the first time, it's going to say count 1, right? And it will continue until it reaches the 5th loop. So after it complete the 5th loop, it's going to exit the loop. So this is how you want to update. What is the max, right? I always know that for the for loop, how you start, right? How you want to end and how you want to update, okay? And then we are going to do a return 0 to complete the program. So if you run this, let's go here, right? I tried to put it on the light mode so it's easier to see in the front. So keep in mind that we're putting the for loop inside our main function and it's inside the curly brace because it's part of the function. So when we run this, you would see that it's going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it did it 5 times. And after that, it stops, right? And you can use for loop for many things, not just to count. We will learn how to be able to implement this for things like adding up total, right? So let's say that if you have 5 of the same items, it's going to keep adding the price for each of those items, and it's going to total that up and give you the subtotal, right? So we can use a for loop this way. You can, in my world, right, in the technical, like the IT or the cybersecurity world, I can use a for loop like this to write a script to install drivers on 5 computers, right? Or 500 computers. So it's going to keep doing it, right? And I just have to specify which computer in an array. And each time that it installs, it's going to access each computer and then install the application or the updates or the driver on it. So you see quite a bit in looping for automation. So that way, as human, we don't have to repeat the same thing many times, right? And in the case of analytics, in the case of you having the same data or a set of data, a for loop is very useful to access each element of that data container. Okay, so we're going to look at the example and we're going to use it to write the next program. What we're going to do is I wanted to make it like a health program. You know how people wear those smart watch and it's able to keep steps, right? Like if you're exercising, if you're walking, it's able to keep the steps. But in our program, it's not that intuitive yet. We're just going to do a base program so that way you can see. So this program is going to prompt the user to input their daily walking steps. So each day, how many steps did they walk? And then we're going to use the for loop to calculate that for 7 days, right? So if I did 100 steps each day, then it will just be able to loop it 7 times, right? Technically, people would have different steps for different days, and you can implement it that way. Okay, so let's take a look at the program. So I did one. And let me pull this down so you can see. Okay, so just like the example program at the top, I would have IO stream because we're just using CIN and COut, right? CIN for input and COut to display the steps. We're gonna add using namespace std, so that way we don't have to type std each time. In the main function, I have 2 variables. One is going to be the steps that the user take each day. And you can do daily steps, or you can just use steps like what I did. And then the second variable, I initialize it at 0 because each loop, we're going to add the number of steps into this variable so we can have a total step for the week. Now, when we look at the for loop, first, we're going to have the int day, and you can call it I, you can call it count, however you want to do that. So I chose to use a variable called day to keep count, right? Or to have a start of my loop. So I'm going to start at day 1. And I'm going to go up to day 7 because there are 7 days in the week. And after each day, right, it's going to add up the steps. So we are going to do a postfix, right, after each loop. It's going to increase the count, right? So it's going to go from day 1 to day 2 after it loops the first time. And inside my for loop, I would prompt the user to enter the step for the day. And I want to display like day 1, right? And so I added the semicolon so that way it looks nice. That's for aesthetic. So it would say day 1, day colon 1, right? And after the prompt, I have the user input recorded into the variable steps, which is declared right under main. So if the user type in 21 steps, it's going to record that here. And as we have the user input each day, we want to add it up. So the total steps, the variable that I had initialized at 0 above, I'm going to bring it down and I'm going to use a compound assignment operator to be able to add each day's steps into the total. So this is going to give me accumulated total. Now this is a comment. You don't have to put the comment, but the comment is useful when you want to see what's going on. And then I have a cout. I wanted to display the total number of steps that the user had taken for the week. And I simply bring down the value. So the total steps variable is going to get added after my string here. And then I'm going to do an end line. So we're working on the first exercise in lab 5. Now, each day it's going to prompt. So it's going to prompt the user to input the steps for day 1 and then day 2, right? Every time it loops. So each day is going to be different, or you can have the same value. But that is more realistic than if we would take one input and multiply it by 7, right? So we want to loop each time and ask the user day 1, how many steps did they take? And then day 2, how many steps did they take? And so on until it reaches day 7 and the loop is going to exit. Then after it has the total amount at the end of the 7th loop, it's going to execute the last line, which is it's going to display the total. So this is how you can do a for loop with the running sum, right? We will talk about the running sum in part B. Any question? So for exercise 1, we simply implement a for loop. And inside our for loop, we want to prompt the user to input the steps. we wanted to loop it from day 1 to day 7 because we want to calculate the total steps for the week. And then at the end of our program, we want to display, we want to output the total number of steps that the user has taken. So similar to your example, the only difference is that we have input in our exercise, right? You want your program to be interactive. Now you can do calories count the same way, right? I can have day 1, if you're looking at like a health program, you can prompt the user to input their calories, and then day 2 and so on, and then you can add it up. So when you're looking at like health application, a lot of the times, it requires the user. Now, if you want that to be automatically sent, so let's say I can use the camera to scan my food and it will be able to determine, or I can input the type of food that I eat and it will convert that to calories for me. So that's an additional step that you would put inside that for loop, right? So for day 1, I can ask the user to input what they ate for lunch and dinner, and then we would be able to correlate whatever the type of food that they have to the calorie numbers. So there's endless things that we can implement for health, for different things, and just simply applying the concept. And you can do the same, you can use for loop like what we talked about last time for input validation as well, right? I can use it to check how many times that the user log in incorrectly, right? And if it reaches the 5th time or the 3rd time, it can exit. So you can use a for loop in place of a while loop that way. It really depends on how you want to approach the problem. Okay. So if you run this, right, you can see that it requires each day input, and you can test it. So if I did 33 steps, day 1, 45 steps, day 2, right, 66, day 3, 82, day 4, and so on, right, 21, 99, right, and then 30. So at the end, before it exit, it tells me the total number of steps. And then if you want to flesh out more on the program, you can take those steps and convert it to how many calories you burn, those type of things. I think a lot of the time fitness apps are very popular, right? A lot of people are really into fitness. And so we can look at like the things that you want to build in the future. So if you want to make a program to calculate your grades, right, for like each test, if you have, let's say, 4 tests and you wanted to calculate your total grade and then find an average for it and convert it to ladder, you can implement a for loop as well. So there's so many things. Any question? Now, in the real world application, you might have like separate files of separate codes for different functionality. We'll talk about function later. You can integrate this into a separate function, and then you simply call that function. Like, let's say I want to calculate the steps, and then I want to calculate calories for food intake, and I want to calculate calories burned in other exercises. So you can incorporate all of those code into an app, right? And then execute it so that way it is modular in design. Okay, so screenshot it. Once you complete, add it to your exercise 1 area or your document. And you saw a little bit of running sum. So your book calls this running total, but most people know it as running sum. So running sum simply is that you're adding up your numbers, right? Your values as you go. So in the case, if we're using a loop, each loop is going to add the value. And you see this in business application all the time, right? Like, let's say you walk into McDonald's and you order, like a burger, French fries, a drink, and chicken nuggets, right? So each of the item you add to cart, right, it's going to, because it's going to prompt you each time how, what other items you want to add. And you see this with online shopping, restaurants, all kinds, or even inventory if you work in like stocking items on shelves, etc. So we can start with a base, which is a value. Typically, we would start initializing your total variable at 0 because you want a container to keep storing, updating the data as you add them, right? So your cart initially, like an online shopping cart, it would have 0 as a value. And then as you add the items, right, and the number of the items that you want to buy, it's going to update the 0 to the price of each item that you add to the cart. And we can loop through it to keep summing it up until we have a subtotal. And then based on that, we can calculate tax and shipping for an online order, right? So running sum is very popular. So what kind of things that you can use it for? You can do it for your daily expenses, your grade score, sales, running distance, marathon stuff, all kinds, right? So it would be something like this. We would do a for loop, right? And I mentioned that there are 3 parts in the loop: how you start, how you end, and how you want to update each time. And then inside the for loop body, you're always going to have some kind of variable. And typically we would use a compound assignment to just adding the current value to the total. Okay. All right. So let's look at how we can make a daily or a weekly expense app. Okay. We are going to calculate the things that we spend on, right? And we want to initialize your total variable with the 0 to start, and then we would update it as we go. So this is an example for tracking your daily expense. I have your include IO stream at the top for CNC out using namespace std. And in the main function, I simply have blush you two variables. One is going to be for my daily expense, and 2, it's going to use a double type. So we are just going to keep it on the same line, and it's going to add it to the total for each loop. So the total variable here is going to get updated, right, with each value that we input. Now this is for look. You don't have to do this, right? Because we're using a console, so we wanted to make it look nice. And we have a for loop. We would start with day 1. And we're going to go up to day 7, just like the last program. And after each loop, it's going to increase. So after loop 1, it's going to add 1 to make loop 2. And we would prompt the user to enter the expense for the day. And we want to display the day and the amount. Okay. As the user input it, it's going to go into the expense variable, which we declare at the top. And we would have a total variable to store each day expense and add it up. We're using the compound assignment there, operator. And then at the end, we're going to do a total display right? Total expense for the week is, and we want to put the dollar sign so that way it shows the amount with the dollar sign. Okay, so very similar to your walking steps. The only difference is that we change up the variable, right? And we would be able to add them all together. So you can even edit the last program to make it this way. So we're gonna do sales for exercise 2. We wanted to see how much the total sales would be for the store over 6 months. So we would ask the maybe the manager, the store manager, or the cashier to be able to input this information. So we would use a for loop, and we want to run it up to 6 times because there's 6 months. And we want to prompt the user to enter the sales for each month. And we want to add up each month's sales to the total and display how much they made in sales. Okay. So instead of keeping personal finance, we're going to keep the business finance. So we're going to track the business sales. Okay. So similar to the example that you see, I have include IO stream at the top for C in and C out. I have using namespace std. In the main function, I declare 2 variables. One is going to be double sales, and the second variable is the total sales. So the sales, the first variable is for the monthly sales, and the second variable that's going to get updated as it loops, so that way I can add up the 6 month in sales. Now this is for prettiness. You don't have to put that, but I put it so that way it shows that this is my app, right? Store monthly sales tracker. And in the for loop, I use month as a variable. And this is how I start with month 1. And as each of the loop, it's going to go all the way to loop 6, which is 6 months. And after each loop, I would increase. So how you start, how you end, and how you want to update is the 3 parts for the for loop. Then inside the for loop, I prompt the user to enter the sales for each month. I bring down the month information. So month 1, it's going to be this amount of dollars. So I want to add the colon space, the dollar sign, so that way it looks nice. And then I want to have the user input store into the sales, which is going to be the monthly. And then below it, I would have a total sales variable, which I declare up here. And I want to be able to add up each month's sales as it loops. So that is considered a running sum part. And similar to the other 2 program, at the end, I want to display the total sales for my 6 months and bring down your variable value that after the end of the 6th loop, and then end line and return 0. So as you do it, you see, right, the similarity. What we have is the total is when we would use the compound assignment operator, where we would add each input for each month each time it loops. So you can loop 600 times and it will add it for you, right? So that's the whole point. And for loop is beautiful in that it can be used to streamline a lot of the tasks. So the complete automation would be, instead of manual input, I can create a for loop to input the value into it, right? And then using an array. So I can set up a container and I would have a bunch of values in there, right? And I can create a for loop to be able to input and a for loop to be able to add everything up and output. So that you see in that will be complete automation. We use that quite a bit in the technical world, right? You have everything that you don't really need any kind of manual input. But if you want interaction with the user, then you would ask the user to be able to enter the information. Any question? So the takeaway is that we always want to have 3 parts in the for loop, right? And you can incorporate output and input inside as it loops. So each time it loops, it will display something and it can have the input recorded each time. So we can go up to the maximum amount. And in this case, we have 6. And notice that you have a curly brace to close your loop block, right? Open and close. So after the parentheses, remember that there's a curly brace to open, and after the body of your for loop, that block, you are going to close the curly brace. Now, if you don't put the 3 parts and separate it by the semicolon, the compiler will complain, right? So making sure that you know that there are 3 parts and each part is separated by a semicolon, not a comma. Okay, so after you complete the program, make sure you test it, right? You will have to enter the values for each month and see if it will output the total. So when I teach Python for cybersecurity, I always show the student, or networking, we can use a for loop to implement. Like, let's say that you have like 10 different type of servers and you have to configure them in the same way, you can implement that with the for loop, right? Like I can set a certain setting and that streamline the process for technicians and administrator. So the application of the for loop is very useful. Any question? Okay, so that would be your exercise 2 from lab 5. Once we're complete, take a screenshot of your code and your output and add it to your document. Okay, we only have a couple more to go. Next, we're going to talk about sentinel. And other languages also use sentinel. You see this quite a bit when you want to use a keyboard signal, like a key on your keyboard, to be able to end a certain input. So for example, remember we talked about case switch, right? And often that you would have to break it out of the case. Well, what if you ask the user to enter 5 things, but you don't want to implement case switch statement, okay? Or switch statement. What you want to do is you can implement a thing called a sentinel. You can set a certain value on your keyboard, like 0 or -1, something so that way when someone strike that key, it stops the loop or it stops that task. Now sentinel simply tells the loop that here's the data, right? That's all the data, all that we need for the app, and it's going to stop. So that signal just terminates whatever that it's doing at that moment, right? So if I want like the user to not input anything else, they can strike that 0 to get out of that mode and then not having to input anymore, right? Because in some cases it's always going to wait for the next input. If you implement a while loop, it's always going to wait for the next input, and what we want is we want to break out of that loop. So if you want to set it up where we are not sure how many times the user going to enter the data, you would want to use a sentinel, okay? Because they might be, so for example, if I'm shopping online, I can add as many items as I want, right? But if I click checkout, basically that button activate a sentinel to stop me from adding more. In order to add more, I have to go back 2 prior steps, right? I have to look at the shopping cart again and then add more items, okay? So that simply allows us to proceed into the next step. And when you're uncertain that how many times that they're going to be able to enter some kind of data, then you would use a sentinel. So a lot of the times you see program is using -1 or 0, or sometime the developer is going to say you need to press like a space bar, whatever key, right? But you want to use some kind of value to indicate that it is a sentinel. It's a special number that it's going to finish up. It's going to wrap up that task and it's going to proceed. Okay. Sometimes you also see that it use Q for quit or E for exit, right? So that's really up to you on how you want to implement the sentinel. Depending on the purpose of your program, and we want to think about this and say, okay, I wanted to use a Q for quit. Everybody knows that quit means stops, right? But in other cases, you might not have user that knows quit for stop, then you can implement a numerical value. Okay. So here's the program. We have a variable called number. We have a variable called sum, and we prompt the user to enter the number. Notice that you want to set your sentinel in the prompt. You want to tell the user, because I might enter one number and the next step I want to stop, right? You don't know, we're uncertain. So we want to specify the sentinel information inside the parentheses there to show the user that they can stop by using a certain value. So we're going to record the number and we would implement a while loop. As long as the number is not -1, right? We're just going to keep adding the number. And we keep prompting them to enter the next number, okay? So you often see that when a while loop is used, you would use a sentinel, okay? Because it's always going to wait for the next input, in this case, so that way it can add. And then once they stop, right? Once it stopped, then we are going to have a total and we'll return it to 0. So you can test it, right? So if, as you know, you can keep on adding the number until, so if they enter a -1, then it's going to stop that loop. So it's going to check true here and it's going to exit the while loop and proceed to the next line in the program. Okay, it's going to execute the next line. So simply a sentinel is a way that we specify the instruction to the user. Then we want to implement that condition so that way it would check true to exit the loop. Any question regarding the example? So you can copy and paste that and run it to see how it works. So we will do a user grocery tracking application. We want to track their spending on their grocery. We want to prompt the user to enter each item price, right? And then we're going to use a sentinel to wrap up the input. So let's say that I want to input 5 items, then whatever the sentinel value is, I enter that and it's going to stop there. Another user might want to input 50 items, right? Because they have a bigger grocery list. So because we're uncertain, we're going to use a sentinel in our program. We can implement a while loop to be able to calculate the total for all the grocery items. And we want to display how much they're spending on grocery. Okay. All right. Let's look at my program. For exercise 3. So I have include IO stream at the top like all the others using namespace std. In the main function, I have 2 variables. One is going to store the price of each of the grocery item. 2 is going to be the total, so that way it adds up all my costs. And line 15 is for prettiness. You don't have to put that, but we want to show what kind of app that we're making. So it is a grocery spending tracker. We're going to prompt the user to enter the item price. And in this case, I'm using a 0 to finish. It makes sense because if they put 0 for price, it's not valid either. So we would use 0 to finish. So a user might enter 3 items, another user might enter 10 items, right? So when they finish entering, they would type 0. So you want that in the instruction with the prompt. And for each of the item, we're going to record the input cin into the price variable. Now, similar to your example program, I'm going to control my while loop. As long as price is not 0, then it's going to keep adding up the price for each of my item each time. And it's going to record the next price. So once I'm done, if as a user, I'm going to type in the 0, it's going to check true here, and it's going to exit the program, and it's going to display my total spending for grocery. So line 26 simply is a C out. We want to show the total spending, and we bring down the total variable that adds up all the price, right? And then we return 0 and you close the curly brace and we're done. So if I want to use the letter Q, right, you just have to implement that into your condition when price is not Q. Then it's going to keep adding and it's going to record the next price. And then I would also need to match that up with the instruction because you can't mix match, right? You want to make sure that your program is accurate and not having unclear instruction. So it needs to be precise and clear. Now, the type of program that's run in console, which is what you're experiencing now, we would have to implement like this. In the future, if you learn how to make UI with like buttons and things like that, right? You can have a button called exit. And when you click that button, so in the back, we still have to program that button when the user click that button. So your program is always going to wait for that signal. So when they click the exit button, it's going to exit out of that task. Okay. So we're still going to have to implement that condition for our button. Okay, so once we're finished with this program, it's very similar to what you see in the other example 3, just test it. Test it with the sentinel. So after input a couple of times, then you can press 0 to see if it stops and give you the total. Otherwise, it's going to keep infinitely running, right? That allows us to stop the while loop from infinitely running is the sentinel in this case. Your book also have extra exercises for you to look at. I think your program challenges that he requires also require this, but if you want additional practice, you can do some exercises from the textbook or from online. Any question? So I see this in my discrete structure class project all the time, right? I make them write. They have options to do a cryptography program or like a similar to a smaller data analytics program with probability and things. And I normally see this in the prompt when they're using console. So to implement Sentinel, especially for cryptography, it would ask the user to input like a phrase that they want to encrypt, and then it will encrypt. When they're done, they would just press the key. So simply just implement the condition in a while loop like this will take care of it. Okay. One more to go. We're finishing way ahead of time. Any question? Okay. No? Easy? So I say more of the complex one for last. Okay, but once you do it, it's great because now you don't just have data within your program, you can actually port your data into files. Okay. Now, I'm pretty sure that you're familiar with malware, right? Like I try to make it relevant for you in as a user in security world, right? Malware is simply a code that people write, right? And a lot of the malware, like a virus, it's like a file virus, it comes from file. So basically, right, it is embedded into a file. It could be file for your system, a lot of times it is. Or I'm pretty sure you heard of like a I love you virus where it's like a fake love note. And when people download it, right, it executes the malicious code. So the code is simply very similar to what you see in all languages. Like it could be Java, it could be C++, it could be Python, etc. Right? So you're going to learn how to read file with your code and output to file with your code. Okay? I don't encourage you to write malware, but sometimes you have to work with malware, right? If let's say that you aspire to be an engineer that does reverse engineering for malware, then you have to read the actual code and look at low level and what it's doing, right? That could be a lot of money also. So let's talk about file operation. So after we're finished with 3, make sure you add the screenshot. So file operations is a way that we can take the user input data in our program or the data that we have in the program. It doesn't necessarily have to be input. And we want to put it into a file. Let's say that in data analytics, a lot of the times you see that data gets into like Excel or XML. So that way, you might have thousands and thousands of data, okay? And then you can clean it up later and you can analyze the trend of your data. And then you can create an algorithm for machine learning to be able to help you make the decision for other areas like your business, okay? So unlike the variable, because the variable is temporary, you don't want to put permanent data there. You want to put permanent data in a database or in a file. Okay, so we can save it. A common thing that you see when you go to the store and you buy things and they print out receipts, right? Simply, we can put it into a text file and then print that text file. That's your receipt, right? That's your invoice. That's your statement, right? For your credit card. All of these things are really applied to what we use currently. So we can save the data that we have from our app, like grades, sales, logs, right, spending, into a file. And we can keep record of it so that way we can refer to it later. But we can also use this in other ways, right? Like if you're looking at sensors, for example, when you go to Starbucks, you see the refrigeration that they have there. They have all sensor. We can monitor. We can have a report of the temperature, right? In the case that if something goes wrong, if that's going to show up on a report file, and we can email that report file to the company that service the actual system. right? So there's so many things that we can use it with. You can share data across different programs. So if you're creating a modular program, that means that you have different code files, right? You can take one piece of data from one code and bring that into another code, okay? So when people tell you to download an app, usually it's a package and it's a group of code files that work together to be able to give you that. In your games that you play, your data is shared, okay? It's not staying in one permanent location, right? They sync that to a database. So if you log in on your game console or on your computer, and you still have that account information, it's gonna pull the data down that way. Okay. So with this, we're gonna see these are the function on how you can use to output or input into a file. And you're always going to use fstream library in C++ and C. So fstream, so you have to say include fstream at the top. So when you have ofstream function, that's going to output file stream. So you are going to write or create a file using ofstream. If you're using ifstream, think of I as input and O as output. ifstream is input file stream. So if I want to read data from a file, I would use ifstream. Okay. And then fstream in general, it will do both read and write. Okay. So we can have it automated where our program can read a file, right? And then update another file. So write to another file, and you can multiply file this way without having to manually go and do it yourself, right? And that's cool. So some of the operation that you need to know is that when you do an open file name, it's going to do, so you have to use a function with the method, and it's going to open the file. You can use it to read or write. So when I read, basically it's going to access each of the character or the content of that file, right? When I write, it's going to record, right, characters or content that I'm telling it to write to the file. So writing in the technical world is saving additional information into the file. So that means that you edit and save. Okay? You're using the left arrow to write to file and the double right arrow to read the data. Okay, just kind of like C in, C out. Okay. There's also another function or method that we would use is called getLine. It can get you the whole full line of text. So if you use a getLine, it's going to read that whole line for you. And then we can use a close to close out the file. Always close out your file. I've seen some sloppy project where people submit, right? And they would read the file without closing the file. You can do that, but what happens is your program is always going to be in that mode. It's waiting in that mode. So when you're done accessing that file, make sure you close out the file. And you see a similar approach in other programming languages. Okay. So in this example, you see that there's IOStream because we're prompting the user or we're displaying text. And then you have fstream, include fstream. This is for your input and output for file. So you just need to include this library. Okay, fstream, file stream. Then you're going to do using namespace std. So inside the main, I want to output the file. Okay, you're going to learn class later. So basically, this is a function that's part of a class. And what we're going to do is we're going to do an off stream or OF stream, and we're going to use, right, we're going to create an output, and that's going to be called out file. So you have to create it first. You can name this anything you want, okay? Like in the case, if I want to make file, I can name it make file, out file, whatever I want, okay? And then at the next line, I'm going to use whatever I name here, and I'm going to implement it with a built-in method or a function called open. So it's going to use this to make a file called data.txt, okay, and open it. So when you use the open function, it automatically, whatever that's in the parentheses here, and you want to put your file name inside the quotation mark, it's going to make that file call the name that you put here, which is data.txt. And it's going to open it. And then what we want to do is we are going to put in the string hello file, right? And we're going to add it to this file. So I simply take the text here, right? I'm going to stream it. I'm going to add it to, so it becomes the first line in the file. Okay, that's how you write that data to the file. So again, out file was created. It's then going to then be implemented because that's part of the output. And notice the arrow is to the left for output, right? And we would have your hello file, and we're going to write that to our file. Once we're done, we're going to close the file and we're going to do return 0, and that completes. So this program creates a file called data.txt, opens it, add this line into the file, and when you close, it automatically saves the update to the file, okay? And it's going to complete. So you can copy and paste this so you can see. Okay, so I'm going to run it because we're using an online compiler. We want to see where it places the file. Usually when you do this, when you make a file, it saves it wherever your program code is, okay? If you want it in a specific area, you got to give it a path. But normally it just drops the file right next to your code. So you can run it, right? Now we see in on the online compiler I'm using, here's my code. Look at my file. It shows the first line, right? If you're using Visual Studio, wherever your code is, in that folder, right, it will have your file added there. In my Python class, they learn file operation as well. Usually I make them do a receipt for sales, right? After they do a running sum, and then, so whatever the total sales would be, right? You can output it to the file, and then you can just add text and output it to the file called receipt. And there you go. You have a receipt to email to your customer, right? So it's very useful. Okay. So you can see that your text is, and it shows that here. If I want to add other text, right, I can continue to say out file and then other string, right? And then it's going to keep doing it. You can loop it too. You can do hello file 5 times. So implement a for loop there. So many cool things that you can do. Okay. So what we're going to do is first, we're going to make a text file. Then we're going to read from that text file. I want to make sure that you know how to do this because students always struggle with Fstream in my experience when I taught 17A and 17C. Okay, so in this example, the next example, example 4A, you see something similar. We have include Fstream for file operation. In the main function, right, I have OF stream and I use grade file here, right? Like I said, you can name it anything you want. Receipt file, grade file. In this case, we're going to make a grade file. So grade file, and I'm going to call it grade.text. So whatever you want to name, put it in the parentheses and the quotation mark. And then I wanted to have a condition. If it's not grade file, right? We want to display error opening the file for writing. We're going to do a return 1. Then it's going to see out, it's going to display, this is our program called Writing Student Grades. So the first grade is John, he got an 85. It's going to store that name and the grade into the grade file called grade.text. Okay, so each of these are hard-coded in. We're not prompting the user to input. So John got an 85. I want to put it onto the file. Sarah got 90 and Liam got 78, and so on. Once I'm done with the 3 student, it's going to close the file. So you simply bring grade file down and do a dot close, right? This is known as a method. It actually access this object. We'll learn that later, and be able to execute the task for that object class. Okay. And then when we're done, we're going to show that grade has been saved. You want to tell the user that their file has been created or updated. That makes sense, right? Because if you click save and nothing happens, right? The user would wonder, did you save the file or not? Did you update the file, right? So we want to prompt that. So once we create the file, grade.text, you are going to use ifstream, the same thing, right? Grade file, and we're going to access the text file. And in this case, we're going to read the name and the grade. So John got an 85, so it's going to extract that name and it's going to put it into the variable, and then it's going to have the grade. So it's going to read and everything back to you. Okay. And then again, we want to show the error information. So very much like the previous, if it's not grade file, then we want to display error reading the file. And in the next part, it's going to have a while loop. So if grade file, right? So it's going to use grade file, which is what we created. And it's going to pull out the name of the student and the grade of the student. And it's going to display each time John and the grade. So you can automate it this way, right? If you have a text file, which is very common in analytics, because if you can't clean it up and put it in XML, and in my world in security, when you get logs, right, you have to use text editor to read it. So sometimes you save it as a text file. And like, you know, if you get being attacked, it shows that on your logs and you have to read it. So you can make an application to read it to you. So it's going to read the name and the grade, right, from the file. So it's going to display that for each of the name and the grade. So you can copy and paste the code so you can see what it does. So we're going to use these example. We're going to make the next program. Okay. We're going to make a C++ program that prompt the user to input 3 of their favorite movies. We're going to take the input, save it to a file called movies.txt. And then we're going to read from that file and display it on our program, right? So that way you know how to do it. Because sometimes, you know, if you learn how to output file, but then if you don't know from how to read from it, it's no good. This will be the last one that we have to do today before we answer the last question. Okay, you ready? It's a little bit longer than the other programs, but it's simple. So here's my movie. Okay, So because movie name is going to be string, so we have to include string objects. So you're going to do include IO stream, include F stream for your file operation, and include string because the user going to put in movie's name. Then we're going to do using namespace std. So that way we don't have to type std for each of the C out or C in. Like the first example, example 4, I had OF stream and I do an out file here. And again, you can name it anything you want. Make file, create file, out file. So whatever you define here, that's what you're going to use down the line. Okay, it has to match. So I'm going to do an out file and I'm going to make sure that movies.txt that's in our requirement that goes inside the quotation mark and the parentheses for that output of your file. So it's going to make movies.txt file. Now, if you want to make other type of file, right, you would want to put the right file extension there. These type of programs will be ideal with your simple file, but like I mentioned, right, you can code and make all kinds of file. .bat for Windows system, you see that a lot with malware. .dat. And then underneath it, I have string movie. This is going to store the movie name that the user is going to enter. Then I'll prompt the user to enter their favorite movies. And because it's only 3, we're going to use a for loop. You can use it for 30 movies if you want, right? For loop lets you control it up to. So in the for loop, I start at 1, I go up to 3, and I increase after each loop. And then I want to display movie. So if they type in the name of the movie for the first, the second, and the third, it's going to show each time, each movie that they enter. And we're going to use getLine. So getLine allows you to pull the entire movie name, right? The whole line, and put it into movie. And then also each time we're going to put that into our file. So it's going to pull whatever that was stored into the movie variable, and it's going to store that back into the file. And then once we're done, we're going to close the file. Can I keep it open for the next part? Sure, right? But normally in the system, when you update the data, you should close it so it saves it. And then when you're done, you would then reopen it and read it. So that's the challenge for some students, is that they don't do the close operation. So that way, sometime when they read the data, it doesn't update, right? So you got to make sure that you close it so it saves the update and then reopens it and read it. Just like how on Windows, you know, when you close your file, it prompts you to save and you click save and then you open it back up, you would have the updated information. Okay. Everybody okay so far with the output to file? Now we're going to go to the section where we're going to read from it. Okay, so unlike OF, we're going to use IF to read, right? It's the IF to read and OF to store to the file, to write. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to have IF stream and I'm going to call it in file. So that way it doesn't, we don't get confused with the other one, right? We're going to put it, we're going to read from the file now. So IF stream in file, and we're going to access the file name So make sure that your file name matches whatever that you created in the previous section. So movies.txt, and it is in quotation mark and parentheses. And with that, we are going to display your favorite movies are. Then we are going to loop it. So while we're going to get lines, so we're going to read each line from the file, right? So we're going to bring down the in file here because it's accessing the file name here. It's accessing the file. We're going to use it to read whatever that's in the movie variable. Because the movie variable has, right, movie names. And then we're going to display, and you don't have to put the little dash, but that's just for aesthetic, and it's going to show movie. And then after it reads all the 3 movies, it's going to close the file and complete the program. So after return 0, we have a closing brace, and then that's it. So in this program, we're able to make the file, right, and update it, and then go and read it all together. Now, sometimes you don't need both things at once, right? But you know how to do it now. Any question? So this tends to be a little harder, right? Because you have like methods and you have to create, but just keep in mind that when you're using OF stream, you just got to declare, right? And then use that same identifier in the next part, okay? And same thing with IF stream. You should use different things. Don't use the same because it's going to get confused, right? Output is different than input. So when you run it, test it with 3 of your movies name and then see if you can, when you click on the file, see if you see it, right? If it's streamed to your file, see if your movie's name get listed on the file. And then if you run it, it reads it back to you. So it should be. So this can be created for convenience purposes too, right? I can make a file, add data to it, and have it read it back to me, or have it, put into another file, another program. Any question? Are we okay with this? We're good? Okay. What I'll do is I'll stop my video. We'll take attendance, right? And then if you want to stay and work on this or other things, you're welcome to do that. I'll be here until class ends. Um, If not, right, have a good weekend. And then I will see you next Tuesday. Don't forget to do your midterm part 1. Yeah, I didn't have much success with Canvas because it requires another Respondus program, which now they charge, so I didn't want to pay. And I couldn't get access through the school license. But in the future, I think I'm going to have to print to PDF and then modify the PDF, which requires a little bit of time. So I will prepare for midterm 2 for future stuff, but go through it. You have 3 attempts. Okay. All right, let's stop.